Hi there. Welcome to the channel. Welcome back to the channel if you've been here before. Now, this is a video about hierarchy. It comes off the back of two podcasts that I was listening to just yesterday within a couple of hours of each other, both of which were dealing with the same Bible passage, as it turned out, in Genesis 28. The first was a sermon by Timothy Keller from back in 2001, entitled The Openness of Heaven. And the second was the Jordan Peterson podcast, the episode with John Vervaeke and Jordan Hall, entitled A Dialogue So Dangerous It Might Just Bring You Wisdom. The juxtaposition was unplanned. I didn't listen to them because they were dealing with the same passage, but it ended up being incredibly productive. And I haven't really been able to stop thinking about it since. I think the reason I found it so helpful was that it allowed me to clarify in my own mind why Jordan Peterson can be so perceptive and yet also so tin-eared sometimes when it comes to understanding the message of the Bible. And it also provided a fascinating insight into the contemporary culture wars and the way in which the Bible disrupts their battle lines. The big theme that I want to try and discuss in this video is how hierarchy shapes our view of the world and how it allows us to give meaning to life, how it causes us actually to lie to ourselves as well. But the question of hierarchy is so huge, it's so sprawling, it's so interminably complex that we need some way of focusing it, some way of making it manageable. And that is where Jacob's ladder, this passage from the Bible, comes in. Because it's a passage that can serve as a lens through which to focus a huge amount of what both Peterson and Keller are saying about hierarchy. So let me begin by setting the scene. Jacob's ladder is a passage that appears at a pivotal moment in the biblical narrative. It's a moment both of crisis and, as it turns out, also a moment of grace. We're in Genesis chapter 28, and Jacob is on the run. He's just deceived his blind father, Isaac, in order to steal the blessing that was intended for his brother Esau. And now, not to put too fine a point on it, Esau wants to kill him. So Jacob flees, leaving behind the one stable relationship he enjoyed in his life up until that point, his relationship with his mother, Rebecca. And he sets out, he's alone, he's exposed. He sets out toward an uncertain future in a place called Haran. And it's in this wilderness, far from home, no possessions, no cultural capital, nothing to call his own, and using a stone for a pillow. It's in this state that we find the ladder passage. And the dream of the ladder, therefore, is at a moment when Jacob's journey turns from being not just a flight from Esau, but a slow, transforming path of grace and of discipline and of eventual reconciliation with his brother. And both Peterson and Keller offer us readings of this passage, but they read it very, very differently. And the different readings set before us two different worlds, raising for us all the question, which world are we living in? So let me begin by just reading the passage in full. Genesis 28, verses 10 to 22. Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night, because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There, above it, stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I promised you. When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called that place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God, and this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give you a tenth. Now, if you stick with me, we're going to spend the next hour or so reflecting on what this passage tells us, not just about Jacob, but about how to interpret Scripture, how we navigate through life, how we understand human nature, and how we relate to the hierarchies that are both inside us and around us. Along the way, we'll hear the voices of Jordan Peterson and Tim Keller, and we'll see how their different understandings of Jacob's ladder reveal much more than just a disagreement over a passage. They point, in fact, to two fundamentally different theological and moral ways of being in the world, two different ways of relating to ultimate reality, two very different stories they believe we're living inside, and two senses of what it means to be human, how we change, and how we find hope. So let's first of all turn to Peterson's interpretation of the passage. For Jordan Peterson, Jacob's ladder is about the vertical axis of value, the moral structure, the moral spinal cord, if you like, of the world. It's about humanity's slow, arduous climb upward to what is most real. It's about hierarchy. It's about judgment. And it's about the existential necessity of striving upwards. Here is Peterson.
It is beyond dispute that human beings are capable of religious experience. Why? Why is that exactly? And like you can associate it with psychosis, but that doesn't work. Because the theory doesn't hold water. It's not the same thing. So why is it there exactly? And it's not an easy thing to figure out. Like I'm always trying to figure out a biological explanation for everything, right? Because if you want to find something to stand on, you want to make sure that it can resist a challenge. And so if I can find an explanation for something that's reductionistic and materialistic and biological, then I'm going for that. But that's a tough one. Consciousness is a tough one. The moral sense is a tough one. They're not easy things to crack. The Big Bang is a tough one. So, a cynic might say that maybe sometimes when people are close to suicide, they'll have a mystical experience, And maybe you say, well, it's a last-ditch attempt of your brain to delude you into thinking that your life has some significance, And that's a plausible theory, but I don't think it accounts for the generality of the phenomena. So I don't buy it. what happens in the shamanic experience is that the shaman has the experience of being reduced to a skeleton first. So a death experience, a very realistic death experience. And then the next thing that happens is that he finds himself in a place where he's communing with the ancestral spirits. And then after that, there's the climbing of something like the ladder, Jacob's ladder, say, and an encounter with God for all intents and purposes. And it's very widespread phenomena.
So here Peterson sees Jacob's ladder as an existential paradigm. Human life is intelligible only if there's something to ascend towards. And so the story has to be about Jacob's upward journey. That's the moral imperative, to climb, to aim higher, to orient yourself toward the most demanding ideal, to make what Peterson time and again calls the voluntary self-sacrifice of the hedonistic self with its immediate desires in order to attain the greater goal of moral ascent. And this fits with Peterson's broader anthropology, his account of what a human being is, what we're to do here on earth. And we can sum this up in 3 words: order from chaos. Life in this view is suffering. We're fragile, we're flawed creatures, we're tossed into a dangerous world where disorder constantly threatens us. And the self, therefore, must orient itself towards what is most real, most valuable, and most stable. And that means hierarchy. That means truth-telling, it means discipline, it means sacrifice. Now, here's Peterson again from his conversation with John Vervaeke and Jordan Hall.
We've talked about the relationship between value and perception and emotion in quite a bit of detail. So it seems to me that if you set your aim high, then even if you can't exactly specify the goal, concretely, that your perceptions and your emotions will fall into alignment with that goal, and they'll show you the way, so to speak. Maybe that's, and this goes back to the idea of conscience, So maybe once you get your goal set, and the perceptual systems they're going to lay out the landscape for navigation, you can feel your way along. And I don't know if that's something like, do you think when you're doing that, assuming that the goal isn't concretely specified, that it's transcendent, you're still going to be able to see or feel which steps you're taking forward are reducing the entropy between where you are and that goal. And then, so you could see that both as a combination of conscience and calling in relationship to the goal. The conscience would be the voice of negative emotion, informing you when you're deviating from the path, and calling would be the invitation of positive emotion, informing you, at least in part at the level of emotion, that you're making the path manifest. And
the implication of this is clear, isn't it? Meaning and judgment go hand in hand. The more noble your vision of the good, well then the more intense and exacting your self-scrutiny has to become. This is a moral world built on arduous, demanding ascent. The ladder is real, and both the standards and the stakes of climbing it could not be higher. And in Peterson's hands, Jacob's ladder therefore becomes a universal metaphor for human striving. We all start in the dust, with a stone for our pillow, and the meaning of our lives is to strive upwards. And that the more we take responsibility for our lives, the more we climb. As Peterson often says, meaning is found in bearing the heaviest load you can carry, or in this context of climbing up the ladder as high as you can go. And we need to put this reading of Peterson on Jacob's ladder, I think, in the broader context of the place of hierarchies in Peterson's thought. Because he is explicit and unapologetic about the centrality of hierarchies to human existence and human meaning. He argues repeatedly that hierarchies are not socially constructed. They're biologically, they're psychologically, they're existentially inevitable. There's that famous passage, isn't there, from 12 Rules for Life, where he talks about how lobsters organize themselves in dominance hierarchies, suggesting that hierarchies have evolutionary roots. Humans, he argues, instinctively categorize people and ideas and actions into hierarchies of value. And societies function through hierarchies of competence and hierarchies of responsibility, hierarchies of ethical value. And Peterson often distinguishes two kinds of hierarchies. There are dominance hierarchies based on force and power and coercion, which are largely negative. And then there are what he calls competence hierarchies, based on ability and truthfulness and responsibility, which are both positive and morally desirable. He insists that hierarchies of competence must be preserved, must be strengthened, not dismantled, because they form the basis of meaning and stability and civilization itself. And this is reflected really interestingly, I think, in one of the dominant metaphors in Peterson's thinking. It's the metaphor of high and low. As you read through Peterson, as you listen to his podcasts, look out for these vertical metaphors that keep popping up all over the place, because they structure and they articulate his worldview. High, the idea of height for Peterson, consistently signifies order and structure and stability, meaning, truth, goodness, aspiration, idealism, responsibility, integrity, courage, and ultimately spiritual or moral perfection. And low, by contrast, almost always refers to chaos and disorder and confusion, to moral failure or moral corruption, lies, deceit, betrayal, nihilism, cynicism, despair, and ultimately spiritual or psychological regression and dissolution. And this dyad of high and low, therefore, for Peterson is anything but morally neutral. High always carries an implicit superiority, and lower states are things that you must escape, things that you must arise above, whereas higher states are morally preferable, they're more meaningful, they're existentially desirable. And all of these hierarchies for Peterson are linear, and they're fixed. In other words, there are no shortcuts, there are no surprises. You ascend towards order by the sweat of your brow, by effort, or you descend toward chaos in a predictable, linear way. And this is what elsewhere I've called an N-shaped dynamic. We reach up to God. We ascend the ladder of moral achievement, and our reward for reaching the top is the meaning of a life lived by the highest principles. It's the logic of effort leading to reward, performance leading to achievement. And it's like that prisoner, isn't it, in Plato's allegory of the cave, who ascends to the light, frees himself from his chains, contemplates the truth, and then returns to his fellows with his hard-fought insight. It is a logic familiar to us all. It's the logic, indeed, that makes the world go round. But I want to spotlight, before we leave this idea of hierarchy in Peterson, I want to spotlight another way that he uses hierarchies, because he explicitly ties the concept of hierarchy to his understanding of the differences between the political left and the political right. He argues that liberals and conservatives fundamentally differ on the question of whether hierarchies are primarily structures of competence, which is the position of the right, or structures of oppression, which is the position of the left. Peterson more broadly aligns himself with the right here. Hierarchies are natural and inevitable features of human existence, emerging from competence and the distribution of skill and ability. According to Peterson, the political right understands that hierarchies might be imperfect, but they often represent valid distinctions between more or less effective actions or ideals or individuals. He explains it this way.
When the left examines hierarchies, they see corrupt power. And the thing about that is that hierarchies can degenerate into corrupt power. In fact, it's probably, apart from hedonic dissolution, it's probably the most common form of pathologization. Mm-hmm. But the fact that some hierarchies dissolve in the direction of, deteriorate in the direction of power doesn't mean that all hierarchies are deteriorated power, right? That's taking it. But then the question arises, if some hierarchies aren't degenerated into power, then what's the principle of the hierarchy, right? And you can see echoes of that in the culture war that we're having right now about the definition of merit, right? What's the principle that rules if it's not power?
So what is Peterson doing here? Well, he's framing the right-wing viewpoint as he presents it, as seeing hierarchies primarily through the lens of functional competence. In other words, meaning hierarchies exist because some individuals or some ideas are genuinely superior to others in certain domains. And this competence creates what he calls a nested sequence of value structures that he directly associates with the metaphor of Jacob's ladder, which connect the practical finite world with a transcendent or infinite ideal. He puts it in these terms.
We're attempting to articulate the structure of something like Jacob's ladder, which is this nested sequence of value structures that tends towards a pinnacle. The pinnacle is the transcendent, let's say, or the ineffable divine. Those are matters of definition. And we're trying to understand the hierarchical relationship between our local plans and our ultimate ends, let's say, which is the same thing as trying to understand the relationship between the finite and the infinite. And we're trying to do that in a way that's quite differentiated and propositional, but also is true to the phenomena and the uniting reality of the transcendent.
On the other hand, according to Peterson, the left views hierarchy with deep suspicion. It emphasizes that hierarchies inherently and inevitably devolve into oppressive structures. The left, from Peterson's perspective, presumes that societal or institutional hierarchies primarily are there to serve the powerful, to reinforce inequality and injustice, rather than to reward merit or competence. And this perception leads the left to actively critique, to resist, to seek to dismantle hierarchies, viewing them as fundamentally unjust and exploitative. And this reliance of Peterson's on linear hierarchies is going to become really crucial as we bring his approach into conversation with Keller's, and when we come to critique Peterson's approach later on. But before I get to that critique, I want to dwell for a moment on something that I think Peterson gets profoundly right. Namely, that this life is ladder-shaped. In other words, we live by hierarchies. I wonder if you've ever paused to consider how thoroughly your life and mine is shaped by invisible ladders. Now, from the classroom to the corporate office, from sports tables to social status, from moral judgments to spiritual aspirations, we live in a universe constructed out of countless interlocking and overlapping hierarchies. They're invisible, most of them, yet they are profoundly real, like gravity, pulling at and shaping every human life 24 hours a day. The hierarchies are everywhere, and they are never neutral. Consider for a moment how our language itself is built around hierarchies. We speak, don't we, of moving up in the world, or of falling from grace, of climbing the ladder, or of hitting rock bottom. High, in other words, is good, isn't it? Top is valuable, bottom is worthless. Western thought is drenched in this vertical logic. It shapes our dreams, our fears, our judgments, our identities, how we talk about ourselves, how we engage with the world. It's powerfully explored in a fascinating book called The Metaphors We Live By, co-authored by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. And they write the following: orientational metaphors give a concept a spatial orientation. For example, happy is up. The fact that the concept happy is oriented up leads to English expressions like, I'm feeling up today. Such metaphorical orientations are not arbitrary. They have a basis in our physical and cultural experience. We make sense of the world, in other words, through this hierarchy of high and low, up and down. And this instinct to structure our world according to these hierarchies goes a long way back in Western thought, and it goes very deep as well. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, reality was understood often as a great cosmic hierarchy, stretching all the way from the dirt beneath our feet to the very throne of God. Picture it like a ladder, ascending from stones and plants up through animals, humans, angels, and all the way to the divine itself. The philosopher Arthur Lovejoy famously describes this in his classic work called The Great Chain of Being. The great chain of being, he writes, is a universe of an infinite gradation of beings, from the barely existent up to the absolute and perfect. It's a way of understanding the whole of reality as one grand hierarchy, isn't it? And at its heart, this vision expressed a deep conviction that every creature had a specific place in the hierarchy. Humans, as it happens, sat precariously between animals below and angels above, forever pulled upward by spiritual aspiration and yet dragged downward by our own animal desires. And this concept of the great chain of being, this way of thinking about life as a grand hierarchy, it wasn't just an abstract metaphysics. It structured society itself. Kings ruled because, as it was thought, God had placed them higher on this great chain of being. Peasants served because they occupied a lower rung. To disrupt this vertical order wasn't just rebellion, it was cosmic treason, the threatening disorder in the cosmic hierarchy and order of things. And today, how do we react to this sort of thinking? Well, we might think something like, well, how oppressive, how narrow of them to think like that. But not so fast. Because here's the rub. Even though modernity seems to have discarded this medieval worldview and would pride itself on having done so, the structure nevertheless remains. Now, we no longer speak of angels and kings, of course, but we still rank ourselves constantly. We rank ourselves economically, with the wealthy above and the poor below, or sometimes with the poor above and the wealthy below. We rank ourselves morally, with good people above and bad people below. We rank ourselves intellectually, with the smart people above and the dull people below. And therefore, in this way, and in many others besides, we still have our great chain of being today. And even secular Enlightenment thinkers who rejected medieval theology still persevered with this basic vertical orientation. Now, consider, for example, how philosophers continue to frame reality vertically, all the way from Plato's cave, where humans must climb upward to seek and to attain the truth, to Nietzsche's Zarathustra, who calls humanity to transcend its limitations, to ascend above ordinary morality and mediocrity. Or think for a moment about how deeply hierarchy influences your and my daily life. You likely experience emotions vertically, like I do. You feel down when things go badly. You feel uplifted by good news. You look up to people you respect. You look down on those you disdain. Our very psychology seems naturally oriented to hierarchy. Psychologist Jonathan Haidt points out that humans universally categorize everything, people, morality, even ideas, into these hierarchies of high and low and pure and impure. In The Righteous Mind, he writes, like chimpanzees, people track and remember who is above whom. When people within a hierarchical order act in ways that negate or subvert that order, we feel it instantly, even if we ourselves have not been directly harmed. If authority is in part about protecting order and fending off chaos, then everyone has a stake in supporting the existing order and in holding people accountable for fulfilling the obligations of their station. What an insight that is. We need hierarchy, psychologically, to navigate our complex moral and social worlds. Another way of putting this would be to say that hierarchies are a crutch that we use to make a chaotic world meaningful for us. We rank movies, we rank food, we rank friendships, because our minds crave order and meaning. Even democratic societies, which are officially committed to equality, are filled with countless subtle hierarchies, class distinctions, educational rankings, professional prestige. We say that all humans are equal, don't we? But secretly we still lie in bed at night wondering who's higher and who's lower. The hierarchies are just the air we breathe. Show us humans a social hierarchy and we immediately know how it works and where we stand on it. The hierarchies can inspire us, but they can also crush us. Climbing them can become compulsive, it can become exhausting, dehumanizing. And what happens when you can't climb anymore, when illness or failure or old age or shame leaves you at the very bottom? It's with that sobering question that I want to move on to our second approach to hierarchies in this video, the sermons and writing of Timothy Keller. And immediately we encounter a very different reading of Jacob's ladder, because for Keller, the ladder is not something that Jacob ascended or that we need to ascend. It is something that God descends. Jacob isn't the hero of the story. He's actually a scoundrel. And God comes down to him at the moment when he deserves it the least, disrupting every hierarchy, upending every calculus of merit and ascent. Keller begins very helpfully, I think, by drawing our attention to the context of the passage. Jacob's not portrayed in this chapter of Genesis as a spiritual exemplar. Just count up the reasons. He's a deceiver. He's on the run. He's a fugitive from the consequences of his own manipulation. He's lied to his father. He's lied to himself, and he can't face the consequences. There's very little truth-telling going on in Jacob's life at this point. There's no altar, there's no offering, there's no prayer. He doesn't call on God. And yet, this is the moment when God appears. When Jacob least expects it, when he's least ready for it, when he hasn't changed his clothes and combed his hair and drunk his coffee and got ready to ascend the ladder. None of that has happened. He knows he's not worthy. And Keller is stunned by this. Listen to an extract from his sermon, The Openness of Heaven.
And so you see, heaven was a closed book. He didn't understand what in the world heaven's doing. Heaven's remote, it's uninvolved, doesn't care. But heaven's a closed door. There's absolutely, you don't see Jacob crying out, do you? You don't see him praying. You don't see him asking for mercy. You don't see him saying, "Oh Lord, help me." Heaven is closed. It's dark. And then Jacob dreams, and all that changes.
And Keller sees this and yet, this descent of God, as the Christian gospel, the good news, in miniature. It's the initiative of God downward to the undeserving. And the ladder, therefore, in this interpretation is not a symbol of moral achievement. It is an architecture of descent, eloquently testifying to divine mercy. The heaven opens not because Jacob earns it, but because God wills it. This isn't the N-shaped paradigm that we saw with Peterson's ladder, but it's what we can think of as a U-shaped paradigm of a God who first reaches down to us in order to lift us up to him. And this is not a normal logic. It's not the logic of the corporate world or of sports or of politics. This isn't the ascent to the light of Plato's cave, but it's the descent of light and life into the world of John chapter 1, where John writes, "The light shines in the darkness," as if the sun itself had descended into Plato's cave. No, this is the logic not of the world, but of God. And it has huge implications as well for anthropology. Peterson's anthropology, you'll remember, is about bringing order out of chaos, about ascending the ladder. Keller's anthropology, by contrast, is rooted not in hierarchy, but in grace. In his sermons, Keller reminds us time and time again that we human beings are radically dependent and incurably self-justifying. We're always tempted to measure our worth by our performance, by how high we can climb. But the gospel, he insists, tells a different story.
When the salvation of Jesus Christ comes into your life, you see yourself as more wicked and sinful than you ever dared believe, and yet you sense that you're more valued and loved and affirmed than you ever dared hope at the same time. That is a mark. Infinitely greater self-worth, infinitely greater realism about your flaws at once, which is the self-quake, which is the unique self-image, which is the transformation of identity that happens to anyone into whose life this salvation comes. I say it every so often, but it's been a while, so I'll say it again. If you were saved by works, if you were saved, and if you go to heaven through your performance, then you might be bold but not humble when you're living up, or you'll be humble but not bold and confident when you're failing. But you can never be bold and humble at once. But if you are more wicked than you ever dared believe and more loved and affirmed than you ever dared hope at the same time, because your relationship with God through Jesus Christ is based completely and surely on his grace, on his call, then it means that you can't be in the either superiority or inferiority at all, because at the same moment you have infinite self-worth from his affirmation, you have infinite realism about your sin. You can't get into inferiority or superiority. There's a boldness and a humility about you at once. It is absolutely different, it's absolutely unique than you've ever experienced before.
So Keller would say that Peterson isn't wrong to see life as difficult and moral and demanding. But he would say, I think, that Peterson's entire framework rests on a tragic miscalculation. Namely, that it's climbing that gives our life meaning at the end of the day. And that, I think, is the real core of the difference between them. Where Peterson says you must aim higher. Keller says, yeah, but you'll never aim high enough. Where Peterson says meaning emerges through moral ascent, Keller says grace is given through divine descent. It's not that Keller denies the reality of discipline or growth, but he's insisting that all true transformation, all true growth, begins not with effort, but with surrender, with powerlessness, with the admission of the inability to change ourselves. All true change, in other words, begins with the seemingly catastrophic, existentially devastating realization that I cannot change myself. All true transformation begins with the admission that I can never find meaning through ascent, that I can never ascend high enough or well enough or fast enough. So for Peterson, the most fundamental framework is human ascent, its effort, its burden. And any gift or any rest that there may be in life finds its place as a little island within a sea of striving and achievement and judgment and justice. But for Keller, by contrast, the most fundamental framework to life is divine descent and grace. And any effort and burden that there may be in life finds its place within that more fundamental context of resting in the finished work of Christ. So for Peterson, my identity, well, that's the end point. It's the reward for my striving. But for Keller, my identity is the beginning point. It's the gift within the context of which my striving takes place, and that gives it meaning. So let's put these two anthropologies side by side. Peterson's human, I think, is a tragic hero. Fallen, yes, but capable. Called to climb. Able somehow to bear the burden. But Keller's human is a beloved fugitive. Unworthy. Unable to ascend. And yet chosen, despite this inability. Chosen to be lifted up. And these aren't just two competing moral visions. They're also rival pictures of hope. Because Peterson says hope comes through climbing. But Keller says hope comes from being found when and where you've fallen. And this brings us to a really pivotal question in this exploration of hierarchy. If you build your life on ascent, what happens when you fall? Or in Peterson's own terms, what happens when you stop ascending? Now, to many listeners, Jordan Peterson's vision of life feels not only compelling, but salvific. It's in a world fragmented by nihilism and despair, he offers a hard but hopeful path. He says, take responsibility, tell the truth, carry your burden, and meaning will emerge. And many people would testify that this has saved their lives. And yet Keller would insist that this path, while deeply moral, is also deeply dangerous. Because if climbing is the logic of salvation, then sooner or later, your failure to ascend will either crush you, and you'll begin to think that you deserve whatever ruin comes your way. Or if you ascend well enough according to your own measure of success, you'll become prideful and begin to believe that you deserve whatever success comes your way, and you'll look down on those who've deserved their ruin. And whether you meet your standards or, as is more likely, fall short of them, all that Peterson's position is doing is kicking the can of inevitable despair down the road, not overcoming it in any decisive way. Now, Peterson himself, I think, is aware of this in his quiet moments, acutely aware of the moral weight of his ideal. He knows that aiming high inevitably invokes judgment. To set your sights on the good is also to become aware of how short you fall. In one of his most revealing moments, Peterson puts it like this:
The higher the ideal, the greater the hope, the more severe the judge. That's why Christ comes back the way he does in the book of Revelation, right? As the judge of everything, with the sword in his mouth, as the reflection of the sword that turns every which way, that bars the gates to paradise.
In other words, when you aim at the highest, you invite the sharpest judgment. Your conscience becomes your accuser. Your failings are no longer minor. They are tragic betrayals of what you might have been. And Keller would agree with this diagnosis, but not with Peterson's remedy. Keller would say, the human heart is incurably religious. It craves judgment. It constructs ladders. But its solution, to climb harder, it is a fool's errand. And there's only one solution, and that is to receive mercy. Because, as Keller says, if you think Christianity is for the good, the clean, the competent, you haven't understood it at all. Let's bring these two ladders into sharper relief for a moment. Peterson's ladder is existential. It's moral. It's the ascent from chaos to order, from suffering to structure. Meaning in this framework isn't something you receive. It's something you earn by confronting the burden of existence and refusing to lie. That is a noble vision, isn't it? It's why so many people, especially perhaps young men, have found Peterson's work life-giving. In a world where moral seriousness is rare, Peterson restores it. But Keller, I think, lifts the veil on the tragedy of this restoration of moral seriousness. Because Peterson's moral seriousness must sooner or later become moral self-deception in one of two ways. Either you come to the realization that your hierarchy, your ladder, is not written into the fabric of the universe at all, but it's merely a contingent product of your own culture or your own historical moment or your own personal psychology. And you realize that you're not living in tune with the universe as you climb your ladder, but merely amusing yourself with the artifice of meaning. And at this point, real moral seriousness requires you to stop finding meaning in the climbing. And that is a path to despair. Or, second option, you remain deluded in your conviction that there's some great cosmic significance in your climbing. But you recognize that you'll never climb high enough to satisfy your own conscience, never mind any objective cosmic perfect reality. And at this point, real moral seriousness, authentic moral seriousness, requires you to despair of your vain attempt to find meaning in the climbing, like a grasshopper attempting to jump all the way to the moon. And this, once more, is a path to despair. Now, of course, we can try and convince ourselves that, like Sisyphus, the meaning is in the ascent itself, that the journey is better than the destination. But that's not moral seriousness. That's exchanging the logic of cosmic meaning for the logic of entertainment. Sure, it passes the time, But if that's all you want to do while you've stopped being serious, sure, it passes the time, but as Estragon says in Beckett's Waiting for Godot, it would have passed in any case. As Keller would say, for those who climb, there's always a climbing behind the climbing, or a climbing under the climbing. You see, we fancy ourselves climbing the ladder of moral values as we understood it. But underneath that is a deeper climbing, a climbing to escape the rising waters of despair that we sense welling up around us. A climbing because it gives us something to do, or because we simply cannot contemplate the alternative. To start climbing is to stare moral seriousness in the face and to blink first. And so, as we climb, we must deceive ourselves, either about the objective reality of the ladder or the objective attainability of the ascent. But either way, we can't remain morally serious and avoid falling into despair one way or another. And this is where Keller's understanding of change appears as more morally serious than Peterson's. Because for Keller, in Genesis 28, Jacob is not climbing. Jacob, in fact, is asleep. The ladder is not for him. It's a symbol of how God operates, not by rewarding ascent, but by initiating descent. Listen to how Keller explains it.
Any old place is the gate of heaven, but especially times of being totally forlorn, totally alone, and totally weak. Those are especially the times where God comes down and reveals himself. One of the greatest things about this passage is, well, why does God come to Jacob when he didn't ask? Why does God come to Jacob when he didn't pray? Why does God come to Jacob when he wasn't even living a good life in any way? Why does God come to Jacob? And the answer is, God is attracted to his brokenness. See, it can't be that God comes down despite Jacob's weakness and brokenness. He must be coming because of it. He's that kind of God. And here's what's so wonderful. Jacob has been dressing up. Jacob had been having to look to other people and say, I need your blessing and your approval, so he has to be somebody else. But you know what? Everything has fallen apart now, right? The emperor has no clothes. He's laid bare. And God comes and looks at him, and he sees him to the bottom. He's asleep, in a way. He's completely defenseless. He can't put up any facade. All the facades are away. And God looks at him at the bottom and loves him to the sky. And that's what you and I need. And I want you to know that no other father or mother, no other husband or wife, no other king, no human being can possibly take our complete weakness. They're too weak to bless us if we show them all of our weakness. Really. But here's the one father, the one mother, the one king, the one lover, the one friend. Here's the one who can come down and look at you all the way to the bottom. No facades, see all of your weakness and all your brokenness and actually be attracted to you because he's the God who's actually attracted to the broken.
And there is a further sense, I think, in which Peterson's position lacks moral seriousness from Keller's perspective. Because to sin, in Peterson's vocabulary, is to fall into self-deception. It's to lie, to betray your conscience. And the solution to that is to tell the truth, to bear responsibility, to climb the ladder again. But Keller would insist that isn't good enough. That hasn't addressed sin seriously. Sin isn't just disorder. It's rebellion. It's not something you outgrow or integrate. It's something that requires atonement. I see the problem is this. Sin, once committed, remains committed, whatever follows it afterwards. And in the same way that a murderer can't avoid a sentence in court by reassuring the judge that I'll never do it again, sin leaves a burden that needs to be dealt with if we're going to be morally serious. Peterson has no mechanism of atonement. All he's got is the promise of the murderer to try harder in the future. And what he needs, ironically, given the centrality of self-sacrifice to his thoughts, what he needs is a proper theory of sacrifice. Not the voluntary self-sacrifice of the hedonistic self for nobler goals, but a model of sacrifice that can reach below the psychological, down into the cosmic, into the realm of meaning, which is what's required if the ascent of the ladder is to have any cosmic heft at all. Without a theology of the cross, in other words, the weight of the ideal will eventually break you. Judgment without mercy is unbearable. The ladder without Christ eventually shows itself to be a guillotine. And that is the blind spot, I think, that Keller puts his finger on in Peterson's system. Without a substitute, without a grace that takes your place, without a God who descends, well, the ladder is just one more cookie-cutter demand on the unending conveyor belt of human philosophies that have set some arbitrary bar or other on moral attainment and reassured people that if you do this, you'll be okay. I think Keller's response is, really? Says who? And even if you could do this, would you want to worship a God you could fully please? You know yourself from the inside. Would that be satisfying? Would an ideal small enough for you to meaningly strive for be an ideal grand enough to give your life for and to give meaning to that life? You see, there's a tragedy hardwired into Peterson's approach. Any ladder worth climbing is unclimbable. And despair, therefore, is the only serious, the only authentic moral endpoint of the ladder paradigm. You might ascend for a while, and like Sisyphus, you might fancy yourself happy. But eventually, despair catches up with your illusion one way or another. Or at least it does, if you let yourself become morally serious. Now, Peterson's universe, as we saw, is vertical and it's meritocratic. Your position depends on how well you carry your cross, how much truth you can tell, how much order you can bring. Meaning emerges, in other words, through effort. Climbing the ladder is both a psychological and a metaphysical imperative. But Keller's universe, by contrast, is scandalous. Grace is not the reward of effort. It's in fact the overthrow of every economy of effort, every hierarchy that we erect. The ladder is not for climbing. It's the symbol of a God who refuses to remain at the top. And crucially, I think, Keller draws our attention to the point in the New Testament where Jesus himself uses this image of Jacob's ladder. And on Jesus' lips, it's not an image of human ascent, but it's, for what was to me at least when I first encountered it, a very puzzling use of Jacob's ladder. Listen to Jesus in John chapter 1, verse 51. Very truly, I tell you, you will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man.
What Jesus is saying is, listen, I am the stairway that Jacob saw. I am the link between heaven and earth. And this is the answer to why the stairway that Jacob saw, the gate of heaven, works in a completely opposite direction from every other conception of any other religion. It works in the opposite direction. You know why? Look, Jesus does not say, you will see angels ascending and descending to the Son of Man. Jesus is not standing at the top of the stairway and say, what are the steps? What are the steps? What is the steps on the stairway? The steps are the requirements. Steps to God. And every religion has them. Not to put too fine a point on it, but, there's the 5 pillars of Islam are steps to God. The 10 commandments of Judaism, steps to God. The 8-fold path of Buddhism to enlightenment, they're steps to God. And every other religion says, there the steps are, go. Is Jesus doing that? No. Jesus does not say, you will see angels ascending and descending to the Son of Man. Jesus says, you will see angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. What does that mean? He's the steps. Every other religion has a series of steps, and it's a what? It's something to do. But we have the real gate of heaven is a who, is a person. He fulfilled the requirements. He did the steps. He lived the life you should have lived. He died and took the penalty we should have taken. He did it. And that's the reason why Jesus is saying, let me tell you what you will see. If you understand who I am, you will see heaven open. If you understand me, if you understand what I did, if you understand I didn't just come to found a religion, I didn't just come to say what the steps were, I came to be the steps. I didn't come to show you the stairway, I came to be the stairway. You will see angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. And when and only when you grasp that I am the axis mundi, I am the link between heaven and earth. Heaven and earth intersect over my dead and resurrected body. I have opened a cleft in the pitiless walls of the world. I have blown a hole through this concrete slab between the ideal and the real. I'm the ideal, but I've become real. I've come down, and I've done everything for you. Only when you understand that, when you understand who he is, who the Son of Man is, and what he came to do, then heaven will be open for you.
So the ladder on Jesus' lips is not a map for climbing. It is an announcement of rescue. But I think the implications go even deeper than this, because once you start asking whether ultimate reality presents us with a hierarchy to ascend or a grace that descends, you also have to begin to ask, well then hold on, what kind of reality, what kind of cosmic value structure, or in theological terms, what kind of God are we dealing with? And from the point where we're willing to ask that question, everything changes. Because we saw earlier that Peterson's conception of ultimate reality is very hierarchical. If the hierarchy collapses, if the trajectory of ascent becomes problematic or unclear, well then the whole edifice of meaning, the whole moral structure of reality collapses. But Keller presents a reality from the Bible in which hierarchies are constantly being undermined, overturned, destabilized. God constantly chooses and works through the second sons, the ones without social power. He chooses Abel rather than Cain, Isaac rather than Ishmael, Jacob rather than Esau, Joseph rather than Reuben. And when he works with women, he doesn't choose women with the cultural power of beauty or sexuality. He does his saving work through old, infertile Sarah, not young Hagar. Through unloved and unattractive Leah, not lovely Rachel. God repeatedly refuses to allow his gracious activity to run along the expected lines of worldly influence and privilege. He puts in the centre the person whom the world would put on the periphery. So the Bible does not replace one hierarchy with another. It's not just one more cookie-cutter ladder to climb on the conveyor belt of human ascent. No, the Bible fatally disrupts the very logic of linear hierarchy. It wrecks the conveyor belt, if you like. Because the biblical story is one of repeated reversal. The moral and social ladders of the world are not climbed. In fact, they are overturned. Listen to Keller from one beautiful sermon called The Girl Nobody Wanted. I remember The first time I listened to this sermon, I had a tear in my eye. It is the most beautiful passage, explained really wonderfully. It's worth listening to in full. I'm just going to read a couple of sentences now, though.
The Bible is not about role models. It's not about emulating these great people. The Bible gives you again and again and again men and women who God continues to work with, even though they resist his grace, they don't deserve his grace, they don't seek his grace, and then they don't even appreciate it after they've been saved by his grace. And it's story after story after story. Now, why would God give us stories like that? Why would God continue to work with this guy? Unless you're incredibly proud, you don't realize what incredibly good news this is. How can you be offended at this unless you have a tremendously, unrealistically high view of yourself? My dear friends, listen. If you think the Bible should be a book of virtues, inspirational stories of role models we should be emulating, that means you think that the Bible should be like all the other scriptures and all the other religions. But they're not, because every other religion says God is at the top of a ladder. He's put a ladder down between you and heaven, heaven and earth, and he's standing at the top of the ladder and he's saying, perform, do good, live right, emulate the heroes. If you try real hard, you can come up the ladder to heaven. But Jesus Christ said, you will see angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man, because Jesus Christ said, you'll never come up the ladder. You'll never emulate. Look at all these guys. Look at all, they have revelation from God. They have miracles in their lives. They have all kinds of incredible things happen to them, and they screw up again and again and again. Our Bible, our God, the Christian God, is not a God who stands at the top of the ladder, but who sent his Son down to be the ladder. He's not a God who says, perform, but he says, God, my Son, Jesus Christ, will come down and live the life you should have lived and die the death you should have died. And that's the reason why this Bible stories are a series not of stories of role models emulate, but weak people like you and me, whom a weak God had to come down and become weak and die on the cross to save us. God works with weak people.
And this is not just about individual character choices. It's a direct theological confrontation with the two great principles of hierarchy that have structured human history from its origins up until now. The principle of birth and blood in the ancient world, and the principle of merit in the modern world. And as Michael Sandel has shown in The Tyranny of Merit, these two ways of hierarchizing human achievement are not so different as the modern world would like to think. But neither the hierarchy of birth nor the hierarchy of merit survive first contact with the Bible. In Keller's view, the God of the Bible refuses to reward the strong. He chooses the weak. He destabilizes power. He undermines the elder brother logic, the merit-based logic of the world. God chooses the younger son, not the elder. He chooses David, the prepubescent shepherd, not his taller, older, no doubt wiser brothers. God chooses Mary, the unwed peasant, not the temple elite. God calls the dissolute tax collector, not the credentialed Pharisee. And time and again in Jesus' teaching, he insists that the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. And remember how one of Peterson's dominant metaphors is the high-low dyad. Well, Keller also employs vertical metaphors, but he does so very differently from Peterson. For Keller, high and higher often present worldly status and power and prestige. They represent moral and religious superiority in a superficial self-righteous sense. They encapsulate spiritual pride and self-sufficiency, whereas low and lower often represent weakness, brokenness, vulnerability, humility, repentance, dependence, spiritual authenticity, or a true receptivity to grace. But Keller's vertical metaphors are not structured by hierarchy. They're structured by a biblical logic of reversal. For Keller, the key biblical theme is that God consistently upends worldly hierarchies. It is the divine calling card, if you like. High becomes low, low becomes high. Strength is made perfect in weakness. The rich become poor, the poor become rich. The first become last, the last become first, and on and on and on. And throughout Keller's sermons and writings, hierarchies are recognized as real. He never denies that humans instinctively construct hierarchies socially, morally, religiously. They are consistently critiqued. He repeatedly insists that the human habit of organizing reality vertically, the higher are superior, the lower are inferior, leads inevitably to pride, to injustice, to self-righteousness, to exclusion. And they are also radically subverted. The gospel for Keller repeatedly turns these hierarchies upside down in the ways that I've been describing. But fourthly and crucially, these hierarchies are also fulfilled in the gospel. True wisdom, true strength, true power, in the end, shows itself in a divine foolishness, a divine weakness. And this is the distinctive biblical logic that some theologians have called subversive fulfillment, that characterizes the Bible's relationship to the hierarchies, to the ladders of this world. And one of Keller's key passages for explaining this reversal is from 1 Corinthians. Let me just read from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, from verse 20. Where is the wise person? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since, in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Jews demand signs, and Greeks look for wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. It is because of him that you are in Christ Jesus, who has become for us wisdom from God. That is our righteousness, holiness, and redemption. Therefore, as it is written, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. Now, in line with the topsy-turvy upending of hierarchies in this passage, in line with the subversive fulfillment of hierarchies and ladders in this passage, in Keller's biblical universe, vertical imagery is not used primarily to confirm a natural moral order, to validate some great chain of moral being. But it's rather used to illustrate the radical subversive fulfillment of worldly and moral hierarchies in the gospel. And at the heart of this carnivalesque overturning of hierarchies, the crux of it quite literally, stands the cross. That colossal wooden irony. The cross is the most abject of defeats, isn't it? That reveals itself as the greatest victory. the great triumph of Roman brute power that somehow becomes a millennial symbol of love and joy and peace and hope. As Keller says in the sermon, The Openness of Heaven,
I know this. Are there not people out here tonight that know about God, but you've never had an encounter with him? You might believe in God, you might believe in Christianity, but you've never seen heaven open. It just hasn't happened. You haven't had the experience of his love and his holiness and his grace. You haven't had a sense of him right over you like this, standing right over you and speaking words of unconditional love. You haven't experienced that. You know why? I'll tell you why. Because if you think Jesus Christ points to the steps, in other words, if you read the Bible like Aesop's fables, if you see Jesus Christ living as your example, if you see him living and dying for people as your example, you say, yes, I need to live a loving life like Jesus. All you're ever going to get is a kind of general kind of inspiration at best. But if you see him not ascending the steps as an example, but being the steps, if you see him not as an example to you, but a substitute for you, if you see him living and dying for you, if you see him giving himself for you, look at Jacob, look how lonely he is. You know why he's lonely? Because of his malice, because of his pride, because of his lying. Sin always isolates you, but Jesus Christ took the ultimate cosmic alienation and loneliness on the cross. That is the penalty, the ultimate penalty of sin, cosmic loneliness. My God, you've forsaken me. Why did he do that? For you. Do you see that? Do you sense that? Does that move you? When it does. See, only when you see him being the stairway for you, not just being an inspirational example, but being the stairway, does cognition become experience? Does just believing about God become knowing him and experiencing him? Do you see it?
So in Keller's view, without the cross, judgment remains, hangs in the air. It's always accusing. Without substitution, you are forever climbing, but never climbing far enough and never climbing fast enough. Without grace, even your best efforts become a constant whispering condemnation. And Peterson, for all his brilliance, lacks this mechanism. His world has no cross. He doesn't deny suffering, but he reframes it as necessary, noble, and developmental. He says it's the fire in which the self is forged. But Keller, I think, would say, no, it doesn't go deep enough to say that our suffering is developmental. We must also say that Christ's suffering is redemptive. And that addition, that willingness to go deeper into the logic of suffering, isn't a tweak to the idea of hierarchy. It is a whole world turned upside down. And at his most pointed, Keller says that the gospel doesn't just subvert the world's social hierarchies, it subverts religion itself. This is how he puts it.
Jesus says, if you understand, the angels ascend and descend on me, not to me. See, every other religion has a God. The angels ascend and descend too. And there's steps, and you've got to do it. But this is the only religion that tells you that God himself came and fulfilled all the requirements for you so that he can come into your life by sheer grace, just by asking. That's the reason he can stand over Jacob and speak words of unconditional love into the life of somebody who didn't even look for him.
And on this reading, Peterson is offering just one more N-shaped religion, alongside all the sacred and secular ladders that litter the path of broken human hopes and dreams. And that's not just a theological claim, it's a psychological diagnosis. Because Keller sees that even secular people build spiritual ladders. Even the irreligious create moral meritocracies. Everyone, you as you watch this, I as I speak now, everyone in some way is trying to climb some ladder to justify themselves. until and unless God's grace breaks in and says, stop. You don't have to. Actually, you can't if you're being serious with yourself. And Peterson, for all his richness, for all his insight, never quite gets to saying that. His world is meaningful, but it's never merciful. It's spiritually serious in its own way, but it's never scandalous. It respects the power of the ideal, but it has nowhere to go when the ideal breaks you. But Keller does. He tells you that is exactly when grace arrives. And that's where Jacob finds himself in Genesis 28, at rock bottom, with nothing for a pillow but a stone, asleep and powerless. He's not meditating in this passage. He's not striving. He's certainly not climbing. He's out cold. He's exiled. He's exhausted. He's ashamed. He's come, in fact, to the end of all his striving, the end of all his climbing. And it is this that becomes the moment of anagnoresis, this moment of despair. This is the moment that the angels descend on him on the staircase that is Christ. Despair is not the rising tide of truth he's fleeing by trying to scramble up the ladder. It's the gateway to experiencing the God of grace who descends. Let's think about despair for a moment. Despair for Peterson is the, I think, inevitable, nightmarish end that must be avoided by a compromise of moral seriousness. But for Keller, despair at one's own capacity to ascend, to make meaning in a fractured world of deception and broken relationships, that despair is the gateway to a dream that will lead to Jacob's redemption and his reconciliation with his estranged family. In other words, for Peterson, despair is a terminus ad quem, Latin for limit toward which. It's that which must be repressed and avoided, that which always needs to be deferred, the can that needs to be kicked down the road one more time. But for Keller, despair is the terminus a quo, the limit from which we set out, that opens onto a universe turned upside down, a universe of grace. For Keller, you pass through despair. You come out the other side transformed by grace. And this difference between the ad quem and the a quo reaches to the heart, I think, of the difference between Peterson and Keller. Think for a moment with me about the temporal sequence of love and effort. For Peterson, effort precedes love and acceptance. His emphasis on responsibility and voluntary sacrifice has given hope to many who feel adrift. He tells people that the world has a structure, that there is a way up, that if you begin even small, you can find meaning. And this for many feels like love, feels like acceptance. That someone would take you seriously enough to tell you the truth, to hold you to account, to call you to something higher. But Keller would say that is not yet love at its deepest. Because love that only comes after moral effort is a love that you can always lose, that you're always one step away from slipping through your fingers. It's a conditional love. It demands that you keep on climbing. And that's not the gospel. As he says in the sermon, the meaning of grace. Only when you know you're loved apart from your performance can you truly begin to change. And that is a seismic difference. Peterson tells people in his writing and in his broadcast to aim upward in order to receive meaning and wholeness. And Keller, well, he tells people that they are already loved, already meaningful, and that this is what enables them to change. Peterson's language is full of sacrifice and order and ascent, and there is a beauty in that. It's a moral universe. It has gravity. But what it doesn't have is gospel, good news. And Peterson's framework, despite its psychological insight, it still trusts the system too much. It believes that hierarchy, rightly structured, reveals truth, that moral order is basically intact if we orient to it correctly. But Keller says, no, it can't be as simple as that, because the order itself is broken, and the cross doesn't reform the system, it shatters it. Now, there's an aspect of the relationship between Peterson and Keller that I haven't explored yet, but I really do think it's crucial. Here it is. They don't present two equal and opposite pictures of ultimate reality, because Peterson has to assume something very close to what Keller is describing for his own position to make sense at all. Here's how, in 4 steps. Number 1, Peterson's position needs grace. He urges his listeners to climb the ladder toward meaning and truth and responsibility, but there's a hidden assumption here that the ladder exists at all, that the universe has a structure oriented toward truth and meaning rather than being fundamentally absurd or perverse or indifferent. Peterson often speaks as though moral order simply exists as a brute fact. But why should we assume that this order is stable, that it's benevolent, or that it's ultimately meaningful? Recent philosophers like Contameosu have pointed out that our faith in a stable, meaningful universe is very fragile indeed. And Peterson must rely implicitly on some kind of prior generosity of existence, on some sort of givenness or comprehensibility built into reality itself, something that Keller explicitly names grace. Peterson, for example, never explains adequately why the moral hierarchy he urges people to climb should be trustworthy rather than some great cosmic joke. And Keller explicitly names that reason. Because the world is governed by a gracious, personal God who is true to himself and to his promises. Number 2, Peterson's position needs forgiveness. So he constantly emphasizes truth-telling. The human path to meaning involves facing your darkness and inadequacy with courage. But here's the catch. For someone to genuinely face their own darkness and self-deception, they must at least implicitly believe in the possibility of forgiveness. Because without some prior hope for mercy, facing the truth about ourselves becomes psychologically unbearable. Peterson repeatedly urges people to confront the worst within ourselves, the lying, the betrayal, the chaos, the sin. But the psychological possibility of doing so presumes at some deep level that this confrontation will not destroy us, that there is somewhere a safety net of grace and forgiveness, even if Peterson himself doesn't articulate it. Number 3, Peterson's position needs the cross. Now, he often invokes the powerful metaphor, doesn't he, of bearing your cross, taken directly, of course, from the Christian narrative. But there's a theological tension here, because the cross in Christian theology isn't merely a symbol of voluntary suffering or heroic responsibility. It's historically and theologically about substitution, about grace. It's about Christ bearing suffering not for himself, but for others. Not merely about suffering individuals bearing their own suffering heroically. And evoking the cross, as Peterson does, without explicitly affirming substitution, leaves Peterson's listeners to carry the full weight of the cross on their own shoulders if they are to be morally serious. This great cosmic burden of existence, of injustice, of brokenness, that no one can bear alone. Carrying our own crosses is only cosmically meaningful. It's only existentially possible if the great weight of cosmic and moral burden in the universe has first been borne by the only one with shoulders broad enough to carry it. In other words, God himself. Otherwise, our only two options are to be crushed by the weight of a morally serious cross, or to entertain ourselves by constructing little plastic artificial crosses to amuse ourselves with the conceit that we are really looking reality in the face. Number 4. Peterson's call to tell the truth assumes a prior trust in truth's goodness. He has a foundational moral rule, doesn't he? Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Well, that presumes, does it not, that truth itself is ultimately good or benevolent or life-giving. But why? Why isn't truth just as likely to be devastating or corrosive or destructive? Evolution, as many people have argued, Alvin Plantinga being one of them, doesn't select for truth. It selects for survival, which can be a very different thing indeed. Truth can be handicapping in the great race of life, can it not? Peterson, though, needs to hold on to the idea that truth always wins. Like every ideology that cultivates the conceit that it's on the right side of history. But the idea that truth wins is not itself demonstrably a truth. Or at least it's not one that validates itself consistently in history. But Keller has a different approach, a more robust one, I think. Truth is good, not because it always vindicates itself in each generation, but because the truth is ultimately personal and gracious, rooted in the Christ who proclaimed, "I am the truth." And Peterson implicitly relies on the theological assumption that the universe is graciously structured, that truth, however painful, heals rather than destroys. But I don't think with his own resources he can explain why. Keller shows us why, explicitly grounding truth's goodness in the gracious character of God himself. So, in summary, Peterson's approach implicitly presumes a gracious, forgiving, personal universe in which genuine transformation and genuine truth-telling and meaningful moral ascent are possible. And Keller explicitly provides the theological underpinning for those very assumptions. The personal God who comes down the ladder, forgives, redeems, and thereby makes genuine transformation psychologically and existentially possible. Keller's explicit affirmation of grace and forgiveness and substitution and unconditional love is, I think, the necessary hidden condition that Peterson's moral and psychological project secretly presupposes. Now, there's a great similarity, for all the differences that I've been pointing out, between Peterson and Keller's approach is that the shape of the stories that they tell is very similar. But the crucial difference is the dramatis personae. For Peterson, you are the hero, I am the hero, who ascends the ladder to bring meaning and wholeness. But for Keller, Christ is the hero. In fact, Christ is the ladder who brings us salvation and meaning and wholeness in the midst of our destitution and failure. Peterson often speaks about bearing your cross, and I think rightly so. But Keller insists that the cross is not first something you carry. It is something carried for you. And we can only carry our own cross because Jesus first carried the great cross, the unbearable cross of cosmic justice and atonement, and carried it for us in our place as our substitute. So as I bring this video to a close now, we've spent quite a bit of time exploring the vision of two influential thinkers, Jordan Peterson and Tim Keller. We've considered what it means to climb, what it means to fall, and perhaps most importantly, what it means that heaven might be opened not by our striving upwards, but by a divine descent downwards. And we recognise that even someone as psychologically astute as Jordan Peterson, someone who's offered meaning and structure to so many people, implicitly depends upon something that he rarely, if ever, names out loud. Namely a foundation of grace, a stability that his own stated assumptions cannot guarantee. And at the end of all this, the question that confronts all of us, I think, is practically and deeply personal. What happens when you fall? And Peterson's invitation to climb higher, to bear your burdens, to tell the truth, is compelling, precisely because it takes life more seriously than many alternative life philosophies around in the world today. But as we've seen, it can't maintain that seriousness all the way to the bitter end. It can't maintain that seriousness in the face of failure, in the face of the inability to climb, the unwillingness to climb. At that point, it does become engulfed by the despair that it can no longer kick down the road. Because, eventually, every ladder climber will fail. You will, I will. Eventually, every moral hero confronts their own inability, their own frailty, their own exhaustion to keep ascending. And in the darkness, when that reality dawns upon us, what then? Well, Tim Keller's consistent answer is clear and unwavering. Grace doesn't come after your performance. It comes before it. Grace doesn't meet you at the top of the ladder. It meets you at the bottom. For Keller, grace is not a medal that's awarded to those who merit it. It's the only practical reality that allows genuine change. Because only when you know that you're safe, only when you know that falling won't destroy you, can you have the courage to really climb, to face the truth, to bear the burden of existence in the light of the one who bore it for you. Without grace, the ladder of morality draws you up only to fling you down again. But Keller makes explicit what Peterson implicitly requires, that only unconditional love enables you truly to face yourself, truly to face reality. Only grace lets you bear your cross, because only grace bears it for you first. Maybe you're watching this video and you've resonated with Peterson's invitation to climb, to take responsibility, to pursue meaning through struggle. And that's beautiful. It's admirable. It's even life-changing. But it also carries a hidden danger. And it's the constant threat that you will slip, that the ladder will break beneath your feet, that the truth you discover about yourself will overwhelm you, or perhaps that you'll even make it to the top of your ladder and find nothing waiting for you there, as you realize that deep down it was about the entertainment for you all along. And you might have listened to that paragraph and think, yeah, well, not me. I'm the exception. Perhaps. But do you really want to mortgage your existential and psychological future to a feeling that you are the one person in the history of humankind who will break the inevitable, rebarbative, millennial arc of the human narrative? The course of history is against you. The testimony of men and women down the rolling centuries is against you. Try it if you like. But my fear for you is that you will look reality in the face and end up blinking first, losing moral seriousness, and resolving simply to entertain yourself. My fear is that Peterson's ladder without Keller's grace will leave you exhausted, or fearful, or burdened beyond your strength, or forced to lie to yourself, losing all sense of the fragile, self-made dignity that you'd constructed out of your moral performance. But if Keller is right, if the Bible is right, if grace comes first, then allow yourself to contemplate this, that this universe could turn out to be very different to how you imagined it. A lot less cold, a lot less tragic, a lot less lonely. It could turn out to be a universe in which your burdens are not yours alone to bear. In fact, they've been borne already by someone else, by the only one who can bear them authentically without blinking, and pursue moral seriousness to its bitter end in death and judgment. Allow yourself to contemplate a universe in which, in his heroism, we find our heroism. In his victory, we find our meaning. In his grace, we find our rest and our freedom and our delight. So, as we draw to a close now, let's circle back one final time to Jacob at his lowest point. You'll remember he's asleep in the wilderness. He's deceived his father. He's betrayed his brother. He's lost the loving presence of his mother, the one person with whom he had a really strong bond in his life. And he has fled for his life. He's not meditating. He's not on a spiritual retreat. He's certainly not climbing. He's hiding without even a pillow on which to lay his head. And yet, this is the point at which the heavens open. This is the point at which God says, I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised to you. Couldn't be clearer, could it? This is not a reward for merit. This is the surprise of mercy. As Keller says, heaven opens not because Jacob ascends, but because God descends. That's the gospel. That's the ladder. Not a structure for you and me to climb, but the sign that you and I are already being carried. Jacob woke astonished from his dream, whispering, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. What if that could be your story too?